the Europeans rose to power and world dominion largely by chance. Their style of war was very effective. It did harness the potential of gunpowder weapons, but it occurred at a time when, by chance, the great world empires of the steppe people, the really important empires, were in decline. And it's important to realize, I think, that chance, rather than what the Europeans themselves were doing, or what their culture told them to do, as some would express it, war is the realm of chance. No other human activity gives it a greater scope. No other has such incessant and varied dealings with this intruder. Chance makes everything more uncertain and interferes with the whole course of events. The perspective of the medieval world is a perspective of a beleaguered continent in a world dominated by quite other people. This is not the World War II perspective at all. One of the more unfortunate effects of the World War II perspective, of the focus on World War II, is an undue importance is given when looking at the past to technological development. World War II saw some astonishing technological developments, incredible new devices, and ultimately, of course, we've got even more incredible new devices like the stealth bomber. And it's tempting to look at the past in terms of weapons systems, but that's a very false perspective. Medieval society knew machines which applied to war. This is the Perrier, a traction trebuchet, a simple beam that you pull down on. Take my word for it, it's very undependable. I once operated one of these. The safety instructions were very simple. You pull down and you look up, and if the ball looks as though it's going to fall on you, you run. Instructions of that kind are very important because they are very undependable, these weapons. In my case, on one occasion we pulled, the ball suddenly vanished, we all looked up, and all 8 of us clung to one another. We were absolutely petrified. Instead of going that way, the ball actually went in the diametrically opposite direction, flew over the castle wall and landed in the moat just short of the walkway for visitors, some of whom got splashed. Much bigger is the counterweight trebuchet. Whoops. That kind of Perrier is essentially an anti-personnel weapon, and it couldn't do much damage to a formidable castle like this. This is Crac de Chevalier in Syria, perhaps the greatest of all surviving castles. But there developed the counterweight trebuchet, a huge weight on one end which was ratcheted down, and that could do a good deal of damage. But it was, again, very unreliable, very difficult to aim. I once saw one of these weapons fired. The ball, instead of going forward in the direction intended, went straight up in the air and landed between 2 cameramen who were filming it at the time. They were an interesting colour of white. These weapons are not super weapons. Technological development before the 19th century in warfare is actually not very impressive. This is something that Clausewitz commented on. Very few of the new manifestations in war can be ascribed to new inventions or new departure of ideas. The obsession with technology of modern man produces the notion amongst early modern historians of the military revolution. The idea that gunpowder revolutionized war in the 16th and 17th centuries. And it's a fine example of an illusion founded on a false perspective. All historians like turning points. We all like to discover sudden dramatic moments of change. And the military revolution suggested that quite suddenly and sharply, war changed. Gunpowder weapons made a radical change and a sudden change in war, and they called it a revolution. In fact, gunpowder had been known in Western Europe since the 13th century. The Franciscan Roger Bacon produced a recipe with accurate proportion to the ingredients in the 13th century. Guns were certainly known by the early 14th century, and accompanying this kind of rather clumsy and limited cannon, handguns. I wouldn't really like to have fired one of these very much. In fact, there are Chinese examples of this are known to have been used in the 11th century. What followed was a very slow technological development. This is a mid-15th century gun, it's Mons Meg, in fact, in Edinburgh. When she was finally dragged out of Edinburgh, her carriage collapsed under the sheer weight of all this iron, and she had to be dragged back to Edinburgh Castle. A slow technical development ensued across the late Middle Ages. It was positively glacial, and serious military and tactical adaptation to firearms, in my opinion at least, set in only in the 16th century and culminated in the 17th. The only way you could see this as a revolution was to cut out the Middle Ages altogether. And that's what the people who invented the military revolution did. And interestingly, they are now repenting of it, or repenting somewhat of it. And in at least one recent book edited by Clifford Rogers in 1995, it does seem to me that the proponents of the military revolution are backing away from it and realizing just how long the introduction of gunpowder took and the very slow progress which was made. You can invent a revolution very easily if you black out the longer perspective of history. A much more startling distortion created by ignoring the Middle Ages is embodied in a book called The Western Way of War, which was written, I'm tempted to say invented, by the classicist Victor Davis Hanson, who's a Californian. Now, Greek history has always, in Britain and America and in Europe generally, received very special and reverential treatment, largely because of the supposed democracy of Athens and its heritage to the Western world. Now, I've got to say that I think this has been vastly overestimated. It seems to me that modern democracy is rooted in medieval privilege, like Magna Carta, rather than the Greek experience, which only became known to Western Europeans in the 16th and 17th centuries. But the idea that Greek military methods formed those of the Europeans seems to be sheer fantasy. The idea that Hanson and others have propounded is that the Greeks invented the phalanx. The phalanx is a close order of files of spearmen using very long spears working in close order. Hanson argues that the Greeks invented this as a kind of bronze battering ram, which was pitted against similar formations by the city-states of Greece from their hostile neighbours. He and others have argued that the Greeks decided that this was the best form of warfare, that it produced a sudden and sharp battle, and that was a good way of settling your quarrels because it avoided long drawn-out conflict.